who aren't in the academic world. It's when you've been made hoogleraar, full professor, you're expected to give a big talk. And it's a big ceremony. It's very different from where I'm from in the US. And you get escorted in, and it's with the idea that finally you have the right to speak to these people and the authority. Very old-fashioned. I was actually appointed professor of Jewish Studies at the VU over 2 years ago, but because of COVID and Corona, I delayed my inaugural lecture. I really wanted my family from America to come. My dad is 86, so I really wanted it to be safe for him to come. So it kept getting delayed and delayed. And also, I won't go into it in this talk, but I did in the longer one I gave. It was a long journey for me to get to that position. So I really wanted to celebrate it. And I wasn't going to do that doing something via Zoom or with only 30 people in the room or whatever. So I've been thinking about this talk for a while, and as Nathan said, this is a shorter version of it. The talk I gave a week and a half ago had the long title of Jews, History, and Homemaking, Colonial Contradictions and Contemporary Challenges. So in that talk, I also went a lot more into history as a discipline. I'm a historian. A lot more into colonial history. I've condensed it to here to talk much more about the story of Pesach, enslavement, Jews in the Dutch colonies, which is my area of specialization. As Nathan said, I speak Dutch, I read Dutch, whatever. If we want to have discussion or ask questions afterwards in Dutch, please feel free. And I can also tell you more about how I came to this topic, what interested me about it, how I got from Kentucky to Brazil to Curacao to Amsterdam. So yeah, when I was thinking about how to frame this talk, writing it for this big deal we had a week and a half ago, I thought, yeah, but I'm giving it right at that time right before Pesach. Now I'm talking to you right after Pesach, which is my favorite holiday.
In the middle.
Oh, it is true.
Yeah,
that's
true. After the Seder.
Yeah. It's my favorite Jewish holiday. It really is. It's my favorite holiday. And of course, what's not to like about a holiday that's celebrated by a multi-course meal with a lot of wine. As Nathan said, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. Always my favorite holiday. But of course, Pesach, as you all know, and we're all here today, during Pesach, it's so much more than this. Because this central event is the retelling of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. A liberation from slavery, from enslavement, that leads to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, but finally ends up in Canaan, the promised land. And there's all these lessons, and the rabbis and learned people for millennia have been going over the story. There's so many lessons that could be drawn from this story. And that's what I love as a historian about the story, all the different things we can talk about. But one of the big ones, one of the obvious ones, I think to any of us who last week were sitting down at our seders, going through our Haggadahs, was that tension between freedom and enslavement. And that tension that's clear in the story of the Jews, millennia after this exodus from Egypt that we tell when we sit down and dine together. But that tension that I found fascinating, and I want to tell you all a bit more about, and some of you know this history, I think, a bit as well, who settled in the Caribbean, and particularly now I'm going to talk about the Dutch Caribbean, in the early modern and modern period. So for historians, that's basically from about 1600 to about 1900. So one of my favorite quotes about this is from a very well-known Surinamese Jew named David Nassi, from a family, the Nassi family, some of you may have heard of, who were some of the original settlers in Dutch Suriname. And he wrote extensively in the late 18th century about the history of the Jewish community. At that point, in the late 18th century, had been long established, over a century, in this Dutch colony. And he wrote, and I'll quote, "Surinamese Jews not only bore arms on the Sabbath, but that they did so on Yom Kippur. Did they have any scruple to combat the Black Maroons on the Sabbath? Was it not on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, that they defeated a considerable troop of these rebels?" Unquote. So for those of you who don't know, Maroons are escaped enslaved people who formed communities. Likewise, almost a century later, in the 19th century, in another Dutch Caribbean colony, Curaçao, the Jewish lawyer Abraham Mendes Chumachero wrote, and here I quote again, "The Jews are as connected to Curaçao as any other group because no matter where they go, they return to their beloved land of birth," unquote. So what fascinated me, and why I used these two quotes and these two men as examples, was that there's two Jews writing almost a century apart, late 18th century, late 19th century, in Dutch Caribbean colonies, and what they're doing with these quotes are asserting loyalty and asserting belonging, of being at home in these places. And it made me think a lot about my own history, about what we, or people, or Jews do when they're asserting where we belong, what home is. And the overarching model for Jewish history has been that of a core or center and a periphery, or the outside. But when we think about it, Jewish history's had a lot of cores and a lot of peripheries. So if you think about New York, I as an American Jew, it's been conceived of by historians as this sort of primary diasporic center or core for Jews. But of course, there's other cores, the biblical homeland, now the state of Israel, of course, but also Amsterdam, 17th or 18th century, Spain in the Middle Ages, but perhaps surprisingly to some of you, or not, I don't know how much history of this you get. I didn't get any growing up in the US. Curaçao or Suriname were cores as well. This earlier Jewish diaspora in the Caribbean is often forgotten. And it's often forgotten because of the rise of North American Jewish communities in the late 19th, early 20th century. And this is the story of the migration, like my own great-grandparents from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1920, who come to North America, particularly the United States. And this is the dominant narrative that at least I grew up with in the US, that this is the great migration of Jews, and that the United States, particularly New York, is basically the new promised land. And this is a history that's mostly written, not surprisingly, by Ashkenazi Jews in North America, mostly from the United States. But in reality, actually, Curaçao was the hub, and New York was the peripheral backwater of American Jewry until well into the 19th century. In the 18th century, the Dutch Caribbean colonies, and I can talk more about the British colonies if you're interested, but it's really the Dutch Caribbean colonies that constituted the center of Jewish life in the Americas. Open Jewish life continued to be persecuted or forbidden in the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French Americas. But Dutch Caribbean colonies looked back well over a century of blossoming Jewish settlement and life. First in Brazil, under the Dutch in the 17th century. Then the Caribbean, specifically, again, the Dutch Caribbean, were where the majority of Jews in the Americas lived. So I'm going to give you some quick statistics. I'm not going to load you down with too many numbers. But in 1790, there were 1,330 Jews in Suriname, 1,100 in Curaçao, 900 in Jamaica, but only around 350 in New York, and around 250 in Philadelphia.
What year was that?
That's 1790. Yeah. So Jews began making their homes in these jungle-choked deltas like Suriname or Essequibo, which is now part of Guyana. And I know someone sent me his essay where he looked at Jews in Guyana. Or barren islands like Curaçao, almost from the beginning of Dutch colonization, and that's in the 17th century. And so to paraphrase, the Passover Haggadah, which asks, why is this night different from all other nights? So why were these colonies different from all other colonies? Or why were these places different from all other places for Jews? For one, and this is something that I study academically a lot, this making of a new home, this Jewish settlement occurred conceptually, but also literally within a framework of Dutch colonialism. And there Jews became involved in the issues that colonialism engenders when we look at what colonialism means. That's discrimination, that's racism, and that's also enslavement, amongst other things. So colonialism provided for these Jewish settlers, somewhat contradictorily, a space, a new home, but also shared by different groups, sometimes different rival groups. So then you can ask, but why would Jews have gone to these places? I mean, kind of literally the ends of the world at the time, so far from what seemed to be the cores of Jewish life at the time. For the Spanish and Portuguese, and let me say it's really Spanish, Portuguese, Sephardic Jews in the earliest period who come. Their centers of Jewish life were Livorno or Amsterdam. So why go off to these other places? And a big answer is greater freedom, for Jews at least. Jews were willing to settle in these places, these rather inhospitable regions, because they were granted special right to settle there. And we can talk more about why. But those rights were congregational autonomy, so they can do what they want within their congregations, but also tax exemptions, rights to trade, to take a non-Christian oath, for instance, didn't have to do things on Jewish holidays, and the right to serve in the militia. And this was far more freedom than Jews had basically almost anywhere else in the world at the time, certainly any other place in Europe, including that core community or home of Amsterdam. And it also included the right to own estates, to own land, and that included at the time enslaved people, most of whom by this time were of African descent. So then one of the contradictions, and that's why I had that title with my inaugural lecture, of the Jewish experience of colonialism then, is that it allowed Jews who made their homes in these colonies a lot of greater freedom, but it also solidified difference, specifically notions of racialized difference. For like Christians, Jews exploited enslaved Africans and forced them to make their homes in these new colonial spaces. This Jewish settlement was extremely successful. By the mid-18th century, anywhere from a third to a half of the white population in both Curaçao and in Suriname were Jews. I should say that in the 18th century, you start getting more and more Ashkenazi Jews, specifically coming to Suriname. But the beginnings of the congregation were Sephardic Jews.
Sorry, what percentage did you say? 1/3?
Anywhere from a third to a half of the white population in Suriname and Curaçao are Jews. And yet in Suriname you start getting more Ashkenazi Jews, what they call High German Jews. But the initial ones are Sephardic Jews.
What number, when you refer to the population, how large was the population? So this 1/3?
Yeah, it's still really, really small. It's still small because the African descendant population is much larger. So when we're talking about a third to a half of the white population of Curaçao is still only a couple thousand.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right.
So it's a small population.
Yeah, yeah.
Percentage-wise, then Jews are a third to a half, but yeah, it's a tiny group of people. But yeah, briefly I'll talk about, because my main talk a week and a half ago was about making home. So how do Jews make a home in these places? So I talked briefly about cemeteries, if you all are interested in cemeteries. The oldest tombstone in the Beth Haim cemetery outside Willemstad, Curaçao, is from 1668. So Jews established cemeteries also in Suriname. The one in Yoda Savannah, Jews Savannah, is very famous, has been researched a lot. Jews established schools, established mikvahs, and also, of course, knowledge of Jewish ritual and practice was really important. They established synagogues, and there's synagogues all over the British and Dutch Caribbean. There's a little bit of a war in the Caribbean about what's the oldest continually operating synagogue. I don't want to get into that, but because most of my research has been closely tied with the community in Curacao. I will say that the Mikveh Israel Emmanuel Synagogue in Willemstad claims to at least be the oldest continually operating synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. And its sand-covered floors still muffle the sounds of Shabbat services. But yeah, there's other ones. St. Thomas, the synagogue in St. Thomas also claims to be the oldest continuing operating one.
I always thought it was the synagogue of Jodensafana. It was the oldest one.
It's the oldest, but not continually operating.
Of course.
Yeah.
In Paraguay was still a synagogue.
But it was founded after Mikveh Israel. So that's where they get to. No, it's a big thing also for attracting tourists. Yeah.
Why is it sand to muffle the sounds of Shabbat?
So there's a lot of debate about that one as well. I wrote something for the Volkskrant in January about it. It's a local newspaper. So there's some debate. Some say it's to commemorate the wandering of the Jews in the desert. It's almost always Sephardic synagogues who have sand. Yeah. Some say it's to commemorate the wandering in the desert. Others say it's an outgrowth from crypto-Jews, Jews who had to hide that they were Jews in Spain and Portugal, so they used it to muffle the sounds. There's a lot of debate about it, about where it comes from, but it's really...
It meant they still use it even though they didn't have to hide
in the Caribbean for sure, but at the Portuguese synagogue here in Amsterdam, they also have sand on the floor. There they say it's to keep the mud out. But as these communities started to become more established, and keep in mind, like at this point it's 100 years of these communities being established, they began to question the authority of this home community here in Amsterdam. And they started to orient themselves away from Europe, away from Amsterdam, and more towards themselves. And Curacao becomes this home community, this new center of Caribbean Jewry to which questions are directed. I can talk to you about debates. There's a whole argument with this small, tiny community in New York with the community in Curacao about kosher beef, etc. But in 1789, this is just one example, the Curaçaoan community boycotted the prohibition on men shaving their beards between Pesach and the holiday of Shavuot, which is celebrated 7 weeks later. Yeah, it was seen as a statute that was imposed and imported from Amsterdam and inappropriate and unsanitary for Caribbean contexts. So they're just like, no, we're not going to do it. So that's one kind of example of assimilation, if you will, or making their own decisions, recentering. But Jews on Curacao also spoke Papiamento, the local Creole language, amongst themselves, as well as with African descended populations. And in fact, the first written evidence we have of Papiamento, now of course we know it was spoken much earlier, but the first written evidence we have is from the late 18th century, and it was love letters written between two Sephardic Jewish lovers. So that's the first evidence we have.
It was written in Latin.
Sorry?
It was then written in Latin letters?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's not like Ladino or something like that. No. So, no matter...
I will try that in my next relationship.
I wouldn't, because this becomes a huge court case.
Oh.
It goes to the Hoge Raad.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And they get expelled from the community, and it's a nightmare.
Okay, thank you.
Don't write those things. But anyway, so no matter how assimilated these Jews were, and I discussed that more later, there was also a sense of difference and a need, as I started out with, to assert belonging and loyalty. So David Massey, who I quoted earlier, was doing this in what he wrote, because he wanted to emphasize that unlike the rest of the white population, and this is in Suriname, who were, as one of the governors of Suriname, Governor Mauritius, lamented in the 1740s, and I quote, "Foreigners who have no patriotic feelings and always preserve the impetus to return," unquote. So he's saying, yeah, white people who come to settle in Suriname, they always come to make their fortune and they go away. And Nasi's saying, no, as Jews, we're the one true colonists. In fact, he writes, Jews are true and useful colonists. They're the ones who stay. Everyone else goes off. So Nazis' assertions of belonging feel defensive, when I read them at least, and with reason. Because 18th century writers, such as Voltaire, and especially and most famously, and maybe you've heard of him or seen the pictures, the Dutch-English soldier John Gabriel Stedman, his works were illustrated, depicted Suriname's system of enslavement, plantation economies, as extremely cruel. In Suriname, where a high proportion of the plantations were owned by Jews, narratives of brutal Jewish slave owners spread and entered discourses amongst freed and fugitive enslaved peoples. So various late 18th century geographies, travel accounts describe the uprisings of enslaved people experienced on Surinamese plantations. There were a lot in the late 18th century. And maltreatment of slaves was obviously and understandably viewed as the immediate cause. Most Jewish-owned plantations, and this is where we're talking about Yoda Savannah, which I can talk more about, Jews' colony was situated at the frontier of the colony and made it particularly vulnerable to attacks by Maroons, escaped freed slaves who formed their own communities. So David Nassi was writing about these raids, these attacks by these Maroons. He described how Jews didn't scruple, as I quoted, to combat these people on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. For Nassi, this was something laudable. Jews defended the colony on their holiest day. For later writers, the fact that the most famous cases of Maroon attacks and collective escapes took place on Jewish plantations was evidence that Jewish planters mistreated their slaves. So most of these accounts of cruel Jewish planters actually date from the mid-19th century, when the discussion about the abolition of slavery was most heated. They were written during a period in which the so-called emancipation of Jews, granting of civil rights to Jews in Europe, went hand in hand with growing anti-Semitism. And that's reflected in some of the works published about enslavement in Suriname. A clear example of the employment of anti-Semitic tropes is from a Dutch abolitionist, W.R. van Heuvel. He wrote in 1855, and I'm going to quote, "There are many Israelites in Suriname. Many of them are penny pinching, always ready to profit from the blood and sweat of their slaves, and like all cowards, cruel to their subordinates," unquote. This is also rather ironic because he's writing in a period in the 19th century when Jews were not participating in a large scale in the Surinamese plantation economy anymore. However, Jews were still the largest remaining group of local whites in the colony. So representing Jewish slave owners as degenerates who brutalized their slaves in the blind pursuit of financial gain illustrates the ambiguous position of Jews in Caribbean white communities. And what do I mean by that? They're not black, but they're a special white but not white but Jewish status. And this isn't, I should say, unique to the Dutch Caribbean. Jewish planters in Jamaica, I'd say there are around 900, were also depicted by British abolitionists as being particularly cruel. So the image of this especially cruel Jewish planter turned this notion of Jews as being privileged for being white, Jews as part of the colonial elite, and it made them other, part of the elite but different, white but worse than other whites. So this dominance that was normally associated with being white in the case of Jews was made worse or different because they were Jews. And this image of the Surinamese Jew as particularly harsh or cruel persisted long after slavery had been abolished in 1863. During a meeting of Suriname's Colonial Assembly in 1947, the nationalist politician W. Bos Verschuur attempted to prevent the settlement of 30,000 displaced European Jews in Suriname. He claimed that the arrival of large numbers of Jews would open up old wounds. Quote, The former role of Jewish immigrants as plantation owners and slave owners was of such nature that not all memories thereto have been erased, unquote. I want to return to Abraham Mendes Chumachero, who I also quoted earlier. He was born and raised in the colony of Curacao, when he stated that, quote, the Jews are as connected to Curacao as any other group because no matter where they go, they return to their beloved land of birth, unquote. He was responding to another 19th century white Christian Dutchman, in this case a man named J.H.J. Hommelberg, who'd written a whole pamphlet arguing that post-emancipation, neither Jews nor Afro-Curaçaoans should be allowed to vote on the island. Hommelberg believed that African-descended populations were just simply not suitable enough, they weren't smart enough, etc., all these sort of racist notions. He didn't believe Jews should be allowed to vote because they were not loyal enough to the Netherlands. They would always, first and foremost, put the interests of their own group, the Jews, first. This concern for Jewish loyalty is one I think a lot of us can recognize. It dogs Jews from wherever we settle, from Pharaoh's Egypt to the Caribbean. And this is a view that Chumachero countered. He wrote a whole pamphlet, which is an early example actually of a sense of a shared experience and solidarity amongst African-descended populations and Jews in colonial spaces. In the pamphlet that Chumachero, it's very interesting. It's titled, Will Voting Rights Lead to Cannibalism? It's a very mocking title. It's a fun thing to read. But in this pamphlet, Chumachero argued that Afro-Curaçaoans should be allowed to vote because they're as capable and smart as any other people on the island. And what's interesting in this is that it's an early counterweight to this, what I call, or what's seen as this oppositional relationship between Jews and African-descended populations. And that's created by this idea, I think, of competitive victimization. This is also a debate that comes a lot out of the United States. So, I've cut a lot out of what I said a week and a half ago, but the celebration of Passover reminds Jews every year and in every generation that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And every time, almost every time, I give a talk in public about my work on Jews in the Caribbean, I'm asked what I've started to call the Passover question. I'm asked how, if every year and in every generation we're commanded to always remember that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, could Jews have owned people? I get asked it every single time I give some talk about this. I'm asked, and I wonder myself, what did Jews do at Passover in colonies such as Curacao, Jamaica, Suriname, Barbados, where they enslaved people? And I ask myself that. I'm curious. I'm a social historian. I do want to know. Even though, of course, it was white European Christians, not Jews, who introduced racialized slavery to the Americas. Some of you know, probably better than I do, that in Leviticus, after the Lord brought forth the people of Israel, his servants, out of the land of Egypt, he instructed Moses that they were not to buy or sell each other, but only those of other nations, children of the strangers that do sojourn amongst you. So this passage has always provided a handy explanation and a justification for enslaving non-Jews. But still, I ask myself this Passover question. It's asked to me, even though one of the most eminent historians, David Bryan Davis, reminds us that acceptance of the institution of slavery, if not of one's own kind, of other people, was so widespread and so enduring that, in his opinion, the emergence of abolition movements in the 18th century was, quote, a momentous turning point in the evolution of man's moral perception, unquote. I think David Bryan Davis is right, but it's perhaps disappointing or saddening or infuriating for Jews such as myself or for you all here that when we read every year at Passover, as we did last week at the Seder, that the Jews suffered in Egypt as is narrated, with hard labor at mortar and brick and in all sorts of work in the field and all the tasks ruthlessly imposed upon them. We may wonder how our brethren or our ancestors, making their homes in these American colonies, ruthlessly imposed hard labor in the fields and elsewhere on another group of people. We may feel confused. How could they have engaged in racism and dehumanization as they had been singled out and dehumanized in Egypt? And in classic Jewish historiography, so the study of Jewish history, the Passover, what I call the Passover problem, has largely been ignored. Jewish history has really been looked at as a gradual move of Jewish emancipation, not Jewish participation with Christians in oppressive colonial regimes. This represents a Eurocentric view of history, looking very much at what happened in Europe, not what happened elsewhere in the Americas. European history, but also a Eurocentric view of Jewish history. So I see that I'm talking for a lot, so I can skip over some of this because I have the feeling people want to just talk a little more and listen to me less. Well, whatever. But what I wanted to say was that I think that one of the things that looking at this history can help us with, and this is now as an academic historian, but also in debates in society, is that I think looking at Caribbean Jewish history, including this history of enslavement, helps us move beyond the idea that what I mentioned was this competitive victimization. This idea that victims of anti-Semitism and of racism exist in two completely sealed, separated historical settings, and that's just not the case. In fact, one of the distinguishing characteristics and what I find so fascinating about Caribbean Jewish history is the elasticity of it. And what I mean, the coexistence with other religious and ethnic groups and identities. And I think that's what makes it, it's a popular term now, but disruptive and relevant to contemporary debates about racism, anti-Semitism, othering, because Jews do disrupt racial boundaries. This is seen by the long-running discussion, and there was that exhibition a couple of years ago at the Jewish Museum, Are Jews White? And that's played out in European Jewish history. And it's also evident in these colonial spaces where Jews became categorized, literally categorized as white, as systems of racialized categorization took hold. And it's clear in the fact that 12 to 15% of Jews in the Americas, at least, I don't have the stats for Europe, define themselves as being non-white. Many people of Caribbean descent in the Netherlands, too, claim at least some Jewish ancestry, even if they don't identify as Jewish. And maybe some of you know this quote, as the Surinamese author Cynthia McLeod remarked, quote, "Every Surinamese has Jewish blood. Shake a family tree and a Jew falls out." So
I can confirm.
So Nasi and Chumachero felt the need to assert the contributions of their Jewish communities to the places they called home, and thereby prove how much Jews belonged in these colonial spaces. And they're part of a long tradition of Jews feeling the need to justify or a justification version of Jewish history, which has as its subtext, as we all know, from our own personal experience, from recent Jewish history, that at any time and in any place, Jews' belonging and loyalty can be called into question. So I think, to sum up quickly, the history of Jews in the Dutch Caribbean colonies and the contradictions that seem to be engendered by this encounter: greater freedom, which I went over, but enslavement, making new homes, but in places taken from others, or being supported by people taken from their homes themselves. I do think it offers us a chance to move beyond an apologetic stance of justifying Jewish belonging. And I think it makes us rethink this idea that you sometimes hear, who's suffered more in history, Jews or blacks? I think that looking at Caribbean Dutch history, or Jewish history in the Dutch Caribbean and the Caribbean writ large, allows us to rethink and reframe these comparisons. And I think it makes us look at overlapping experiences, such as diaspora, of course, agency, oppression, resistance, violence, and genocide in these histories. But these are all questions that the Israelites confronted in Egypt too, as they settled, prospered, were enslaved, killed, and resisted. And thinking about the lessons of this story, we're still faced with the Passover question. How could Jews have enslaved others, maybe even had enslaved people serve them at their Seder, as they sat at the table and commemorated how God led them out of bondage in Egypt, with, as we're told, a mighty hand? I have to think about the Haggadah they used. So this is the stuff I love to do, find out what Haggadah they were using. We know from various sources that at least one of the Haggadot they used in the Caribbean was written in Spanish, published in 1689 by David Pardo and taken to Suriname. In this Haggadah, like in all the Haggadot, the matza is displayed. The service continue, and I'll say, as maybe some of you all did, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come and celebrate Passover. This year we are here, the year to come in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year free people in the land of Israel. So this time, the land of Israel in the passage was illusory. It was an idea rather than a reality, a memory of their ancestors, a place few had ever been and never thought to go. Suriname and Curaçao were home, a place they had made in a colonial space with synagogues, bathhouses, schools, mezuzot on the doors, cemeteries. So by calling these places home, the Jews in the colonies were expressing a sense of entitlement, control, familiarity. David Massey called Suriname home, and his essay delves with deep familiarity into the landscape and peoples of this place. Abraham Chumachero called Curaçao home, and said that Jews were entitled to vote because it was their home. But no home's permanent. We know this. No group's ever permanently rooted or permanently diasporic. Power over places, communities, identities can be gained or lost. And we see this in the Dutch Caribbean. Once home and core of American Jewry, it's now dwindled away to a few remnants, around 300 in Curaçao, fewer in Suriname. But the Haggadah my family used was much like Pardo's in Suriname, but with one small and important exception, which makes me think of the Passover story writ large. And the ones I still have, stained with wine and charoset from years of celebrations, the Israelites' predicament is universalized. Instead of only the Israelites being freed in the coming year, the passage reads, now many are still enslaved, next year may all men be free. This Haggadah was put together in the 1970s by the Reform Rabbinical College in America, and despite being very inclusive for its time, let me add that my hope, and what I hope we can discuss, is that all people, men and women, may be free.
Thank you.
So I'll say at the outset that, Dutch, I was asked to do a podcast after my oratio, and I think the guy got really frustrated with me because he kept saying, all right, you talk about the Passover problem, what's the answer? What's the answer? And I kept saying, I don't have answers. I mean, as a historian, my job, I think, is to look to the past, to study the past, to see what light it sheds on the present. But I don't have an answer to this. I don't think any of us have an answer. Rather, me bringing up what I call the Passover problem or the Passover paradox is to make us think about our past and what it means for us in our communities today. So if anyone wants to ask me what the solution is, I'll have All right, if you don't want a definite answer, I will ask you. Yes.
I have a related question. Like in the Torah, we know with every Kiddush or Shabbat, in Torah, if you do happen to be a Jew holding slaves, you have to give them Shabbat, a holiday. And when they're free, you have to give different things, and you have to give them the option to stay as free people in the community, for
Yeah.
instance. So my question, was there also any counter evidence of Jewish slave owners actually being seen as more humane than others or not?
So there's a big debate about that. You can email me later and I can send you some
Okay.
some citations and stuff.
All right, I'll take that.
No, there's a great book by Jonathan Schwarz.
Mm.
He's a professor at Potsdam, and he really goes into all the Torah passages, but also the history. And it's a sort of back and forth. Christians especially depicted Jews, as I was talking about, as particularly cruel
Evil,
slave
yeah.
owners. There's a lot of discussion within
Jews are evil, you know. we
Yeah,
have to,
exactly.
fake
There's a
them
lot
and
of discussion in
opinions.
Jewish communities that Jews were actually better owners of enslaved people because they gave them the Sabbath off, or they would manumit them more frequently, or etc. All that's hard to prove. We do know, and I didn't get into it here, but my colleague at the University of Massachusetts, Aviva Ben-Ur, wrote a brilliant book about Yoda Savannah and the Jewish community in Suriname, really looking at what happened with the manumitted peoples. There's also, and probably a lot of you all in this room know this, a community of colored Jews, so Jews of African descended and usually a Jewish father descent, which was a pretty vital community for a long time. But yeah, whether Jews were actually better slave owners is debatable. Super debatable. Yeah.
Did you look at all that other, like, Jews also had slaves, I think, in India until not so long, you know, at some point in the 19th century. Also Ethiopia, like, did you look at parallel cases there?
I don't know that they had, I mean, there were sort of indigenous Jewish communities in India and of course the Beta Israel in Ethiopia, but I don't know that they were
Cochin.
in
The
Cochin.
black
Yeah,
Jews in
but they
Cochin.
weren't enslaved, I
I
don't
thought they
think.
were freed slaves.
I mean, there's
I
the,
think there were those tribes.
I don't think
That was
so.
someone else, that was in Maharashtra.
I don't believe they were enslaved,
Okay.
as far as I know. I mean, they were discriminated against by especially Ashkenazi Jews under colonialism as being blacks, but I don't believe they were enslaved. I haven't been watching who raised hands first, but okay.
I just a simple question. You said that they left, only 300 left. Where did they left?
Yeah, they started leaving around the 19th century for economic reasons, in both Suriname and all over the Caribbean, after the abolition of slavery especially. But even before, the Caribbean plantation economies were collapsing. So you have, for instance, a lot of Jews from Curacao especially that go to Latin America. If you've heard of the Maduro family, also in Venezuela, a lot of them came originally from Curacao. So especially Curacao goes very much to Latin America.
I think I can answer my question. A lot of Jewish plantation owners, they went after the abolition of slavery, a lot of Jewish, they went back to the motherland, the Netherlands.
Yeah, from Suriname they go
From
to
Suriname to the
yeah,
Netherlands.
yeah, and Curacao they go to Latin America. Yeah,
Because
they
it was
just
the only place to go to.
yeah,
There was a
or
Jewish
to the
community.
Americas,
Pardon?
or to North America.
Yes, a lot of
Yeah.
Jews immigrated to
Kentucky.
I still have relatives
Philosophy.
in New York.
No, family pure Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe.
I think some of those old synagogues on the Gulf area
Yeah.
were connected somehow.
Yeah, so that's a lot of research is done into the Sephardic communities in Savannah, Charleston. They're very small, and it's almost they get so much funding that I'm so jealous for to study these tiny communities, but it's very hard even to restore the Betaim cemetery in Willemstad. I don't know if anyone's been there. It's right by the old Shell refinery, and these amazing old tombstones are just literally dissolving. So yeah, those communities in the Gulf, really small Sephardic congregations that were all basically offshoots of Curacao.
Ja, dat is de aanstelling.
Nee, Nederlands is goed. Ja.
Ik
spreek in het Nederlands.
Goed.
Ik heb op verschillende manieren een binding met deze middag, omdat de helft van mijn familie, mijn oudste zuster, is getrouwd met een Curaçaoenaar. Dus de helft van mijn familie komt uit Curaçao. Dus dat is op zich. Ik ga geen hele mispogen geschiedenis vertellen. Maar wat ik gisteren gezegd heb, en het is een beetje een zijspoor misschien wat u gezegd hebt, maar wat ik toch een beetje mis in het verhaal, is de inhoudelijke link met het Pesach-verhaal. En ik heb van mijn rabbijn een heel kort verhaaltje gekregen waar
Wel, meneer, misschien moet je naar de oratie luisteren. Ik heb het korter gemaakt. Voor wat ik denk dat iedereen kent de Passover.
Nee, dat begrijp ik.
Ja.
Maar ik wil even een paar woorden, heel kort een paar woorden erover zeggen.
Kort, want ik denk veel mensen willen
die mij
dingen vragen.
gisteren ook erg aanspraken. Dat is het woord gerut, dus vrijheid.
Ja.
Wat ik het kern vind van het Pesach-verhaal. En garut, dus het betekent het gegrift van de Torah in het bewustzijn van het Joodse volk. En dat is voor mij het hart van het Jodendom eigenlijk nog een beetje. Dus dat wil ik er eigenlijk vooral over zeggen.
Mooi.
Ja, mooi. Ja.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question. Do we need to stand? No, no, we need to stand. It's related to your inaugural address. I think the core question was how could these slave owners celebrate a question that may lead up to the solution of the problem. But I wondered, you were teaching at the VU, so there are a lot of Islam students. There are a lot of girls there with headscarves. So I wondered if they were among your audience, and maybe they could put the question to you. Okay, you're now talking about Suriname, but what about Israel? In Israel, everybody is celebrating the Seder, and what did they think about the Palestinians? I don't know whether you got this question, but I think isn't the central core question of the Seder this continuous tension between freedom and oppression, which is present in different kinds of themes all during history, between rich people, the first world and the second world, between north and south, and all kinds of equalities, and that it should spur us on. And I think it did. I think in fact the Seder did spur on many Jews in the direction of socialism, of communism. It's a continual impetus to think about these themes and to addresses us to do something about inequalities.
No, I absolutely agree. That's one reason that that Pesach is my favorite holiday, and one reason I chose this time of year to give my inaugural address, because I think it speaks in every generation to all sorts of issues. What I didn't talk about here, but was part of my address, was a tension also between not only freedom and enslavement, but exile and homeland and home, and what that means and how one makes home. I didn't address specifically the Palestinian-Israel issue, but that's of course a tension, and that's what I think is so beautiful about Pesach, is that indeed in every generation we're asked to think about our own history, and we're taught to say that it's not to think it's God who led me, myself, out of Egypt. So we're urged to think what it means for us as individuals and a community, whatever issues that come up under this broad umbrella of exile, home, enslavement, peace, the future, next year in Jerusalem, what that means symbolically or not. To get to your question, I have a lot of Muslim students. I don't know if any of them were at the Odrazi. We haven't gotten into specifically Pesach and what that means with Israel-Palestine or something. Mikhail taught the class before me at the VU, and I think his experience resonates with mine, that actually with the Muslim students, I found a really fruitful dialogue. They find so many similarities between Jewish practice and Muslim practice, burial, circumcision, etc. Yeah, I've had great experiences with them, but we haven't been talking about Pesach yet.
Thank you. Today is the night later. I want to thank everybody that contributed to this beautiful party and the atmosphere and everything together. But today is a very special day because it's Pesach, it's Ramadan, it's today the day of Jehovah, the witness people, the Catholic people that go to church, and the Protestant people go to church as well. So everything comes together one day, and in Holland in peace.
Yeah.
And I think that's very nice, because when I say I'm Jewish, to some people, they say directly, yes, but the politics in Israel, they kill the Palestine. People cannot see the difference between culture, belief, and the politics. We are not responsible for what's happening in the government in Holland and Israel and Greece and Turkey and Syria. But some people do mix it together, and they put your etiquette on your body, on your head. And I think we have to do something against this. I remember that, I don't know which year it was, I used to live in south of Amsterdam, the time, and there's a church which is called Oranjekerk, or an Orange Church. And one day we had a meal together with Muslims, Jewish people, Christian people, Protestant people, Catholic people together. And everything was halal, and the atmosphere was so good. And all the people, all religions and cultures were giving a speech, one of them, and everything was in peace. With the food, of course, without food we cannot talk. And it was so great, and maybe I propose to make this year, somewhere, a day again to make this possible. And then maybe we can, instead of making fights, we can do together eating, drinking, and then also all the cultures can have a little speech, not 1 hour, and then maybe we can have the peace, the feeling of the peace, instead of the war.
Amen. Amen.
Amen. Yeah.
Maybe some final questions, and preferably on topic. Yes. Yeah, please.
Ik ben lid van de WIN, West Interreligieuze Netwerk, in West.
On behalf of
En
Sjoel West.
morgen gaan we in een moskee, Mevlana, dat is bij Rotterdam, gaan wij praten, christenen, moslim, joods, ik, gaan we praten over vasten in de verschillende tradities.
Nice.
En gaan we samen eten.
Zijn er misschien nog laatste vragen? Anders, I will say it in English. I would like to thank. One more question. Final question.
I was very touched by your message of looking for similarities between Jewish and, let's say, the Arab world. Is there anything that you're doing to spread this message in the world? Because I know there is, let's say, limited awareness.
Well, I mean, I have to say that Islam isn't my area of specialization. What my experience, I teach a class on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And one of my best experiences, and maybe Mikhail's also had similar ones when he taught similar classes at the VU, is I had a student of Moroccan descent, Muslim, pretty gelovig, observant. And I think he came in with very political ideas, also about Israel-Palestine, which we weren't talking about as much. Anyway, as I was starting to go through the history, the shared history of the connections between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, of othering, of being the other within European civilization, etc., he got more and more interested in the shared history of Jews and Muslims. And he went back with his dad to Morocco, to their home village. And from his holiday, he started sending me pictures of the Joods begraafplaats, the Jewish cemetery in this Moroccan village, because there used to have been a pretty big Jewish community there. And he was super interested in it and fascinated by this whole history he didn't know, and wanted to talk to me about it, and now will maybe write his thesis on it. Now this is just one example, but I think there's such an idea of division based on recent political events in the Middle East, that this idea of a shared history, shared customs, so many similarities gets lost. So in terms of what I do, is specifically as a historian, is to highlight how many similarities there are in the history, to show that, but also, and this is what Michael did too, in ritual and belief. And I think when people realize how much is shared rather than how much divides based on this very recent Middle Eastern history, it can at least take some of this edge off. So I think that's mostly what I do as a historian.
I think,
Yes.
yes. Okay, so on behalf of all of us, I think everybody enjoyed your speech a lot. Thank you for making it a bit shorter. If you want to listen to the full oratie, maybe you'll be able to find it online now or in the future. Exactly, but at least I think we got de rode lijnen, de rode draad. Thank you so much for coming to Amsterdam West. I think the topic, even though you didn't give the answer, but that's also very Jewish.
Exactly.
You know why Jews always answer a question with a question?
Tell me.
Why not? A nice bottle of kosher Pesach white sparkling wine. Feel free to finish it before the end of Passover, or possibly
Or for next year.
Or maybe for next year.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you for inviting me. And I could quickly say, I was sort of like, well, sure, I guess I'm not doing anything on Monday, but I felt this huge warmth in this room. So my larger talk was about home and my own search for home as an American, as a Jew, but living in Holland, but whatever, not growing up in the Bible Belt as a Jew of America, like all larger issues of finding home that I think a lot of Jews also feel, always in between. But when I walked in here, I felt at home.
You have become part of our family now.
Yeah.